Hello, I'm Sean Murray, and this is The Conversation, where we take an alternative look at political events and current affairs through an Irish lens. In this show, we hope to pick, probe, investigate and uncover the stories that you want to hear. We go where mainstream won't go. This week, we talk to a small band of investigative journalists that have taken Ireland by storm. In a country where journalism has a sustained track record in upholding the establishment status quo, are we now seeing the unravelling of a decades-old marriage of convenience? But before I speak to my next guest, let's get a quick overview on this week's topic. So let's introduce today's guest. Joining me today is Eoghan McNeill, Paulie Doyle and Roman Shorthall from The Ditch. Hi guys, welcome to the show.
How are you? Thanks for having us.
So first of all, Roman, I could ask you, for the audience's sake, what is The Ditch?
The Ditch, I suppose, is an online investigative journalism website. We set up about 3 years ago. I suppose we felt that there was a gap in the market for maybe a bit more focus on investigative journalism, and we didn't really know exactly how we were going to go about it, but we knew that we wanted to focus solely on investigative journalism. And I mean, we basically we started off kind of digging into public registers and land registry records and stuff like that, and that seems to be like it's still our bread and butter, and that's kind of what we've been focusing on for nearly 3 years now. And
whose idea was it to come together?
Well, I had worked as a journalist kind of on and off over the last 10 years or so, and I'd worked on, it was during COVID, a story about Leo Varadkar leaking a document to one of his friends in a doctors' union, a story that was originally published by Village magazine, and I would have worked on that. And it was kind of from that then, I'd been talking to Roman a wee bit on and off, just kind of phone calls and texts about that story first of all, and then Roman had been doing a bit of journalism himself in the background. Like he comes from a legal background himself, but he'd worked on a few other stories in the background, and it was partly just from these chats and kind of talking about what we thought the game was missing, and that we thought that there wasn't a left-wing news outlet that kind of focused on things like land deals and property holdings, and I suppose from some of our stuff, like undeclared properties, all the rest. And we kind of thought, yeah, fuck it, why not? Let's go and give it a go. And it was kind of, I'd say we would have spoken on and off, maybe might have been 2 or 3 months maybe or so, and we'd been gathering things and building things together. And then Roman had come across. It was a lovely story, now I have to say. Like, we launched, as Roman said, was it March or April? 3 years ago. And Roman had come across, it was during COVID, and Micheál Martin, the most decent man in Ireland, as we all know, had, during a time when there were very strict prohibitions on the kind of events you could hold and attend, he attended a prohibited event down in Cork that was just so happened to be held in honour of his father, Paddy the Champ Martin, who was an amateur boxer. And Roman came across this video of Micheál Martin attending this event, and he came across in this video, he was telling an attending Garda to go and take her mask off for a wee photo opportunity, And we just kind of thought, wow, like, it's great stuff, you know. And actually, funny enough, to go to Roman's point about, how there wasn't, how we felt that there wasn't a whole lot of adversarial or confrontational journalism. The Cork Echo had actually covered this event. I'm like, oh no, like, isn't Neil Martin great? And we were kind of like, really? Like, you know, and look, myself and Roman have kind of talked about this since, you know, and that was the first story that we published. And it did kind of come from, you know, having spoken about it all for whatever 2 or 3 months, and it got to the point where we just said, right, we have to go and do this now and then keep on doing it, you know. We felt we had to launch with a big story, and I think that kind of story was the only kind of story that we could launch on. I do think, like, if the Irish Times or the Irish Independent had published that story, I think Neil Martin would have been in serious danger. We kind of were hurt a little bit by the fact that, you know, people were going, who the fuck are the Ditch? Like, you know. Since then, we just kept on at it, and kind of started off maybe a story a week or so, and then we kind of ramped it up a wee bit, and now Paulie's come on board the last half year or so, like, so hopefully only bigger and better things.
That's it. And speaking to yourself, Paulie, I mean, why is this work important?
The short answer is that there was a lack of stories in the Irish media identifying wrongdoing on the part of people in positions of power and authority, right? And I was quite struck by, you know, how successful the guys had been, just the two of them, at, you know, holding people to account, identifying wrongdoing, in opposition to what the Irish media, you know, for the most part does and has historically done, which is kind of run stories about politics that are focused on personalities or rely on government sources to kind of leak them stories so the narrative is kind of shaped a certain way. And so I think it's important that there are outlets out there that kind of hold people to account and that run these kinds of stories, and
And has it been, because I know when you crack that wee word, it's the same, and I've seen it in film. How's the relationship between the likes of yourselves and others in journalism? Say for example, others that would have been comfortable with the status quo?
I think they're just kind of confused and vaguely annoyed by the emergence of the Ditch. There seems to be very much an attitude towards the Ditch that we're not somehow legitimate, right? You know, we'll run stories and the press will ignore them. And I think if they had a broadsheet had run them, they'd all end up kind of running them, if that makes sense. Sometimes the work that we do is acknowledged, and other times it isn't. It seems to be kind of random in a way, you know.
I've got to say on that, like, I always kind of like it when you get, you know, a little bit of love or recognition from an unexpected source, you know, like where, you know, sometimes, I would agree with a lot of what Paulie has said, where there are mainstream journalists who don't like us or don't recognise us, whatever, and there are reasons for that, you know, but I found that during was it the summer or was it kind of late spring, when we had published all these stories about Nile Collins, Neil Martin gets up in the Dáil, goes in a diatribe, accuses us of being Russian assets, etc., etc., etc. And, you know, I was kind of surprised by, I went and did an interview with RTE after that, and it was kind of like, it was a guy called Justin Murphy, who, you know, I kind of knew what I was kind of getting myself in for, like, which is fine, you know, but like, he kind of used the opportunity to hold me to account and kind of go, because Neil Martin had said that we're a political organisation, that, you know, we're not a conventional journalistic outlet, you know, and I had to kind of answer for that, you know, whereas if it was a mainstream journalist, it would be a grave attack on the press. And certainly some of the reaction post that attack on us by Micheál Martin was kind of, similar to what your man Justin Murphy was like. But I have to say, very much respected Shane Ross in his Sunday Independent column that weekend. he called it out for what it was. You know, he called it out for an attack on the press, an attack on the media. He also, if I recall correctly, he compared Micheál Martin's rhetoric that day to be more fitting of someone like Putin, you know, in that it was an attack on the free press, you know. So I always enjoy that when, look, I wouldn't consider myself a liberal myself, you know, but I think when you do have sometimes, you know, people who actually abide by liberal principles like Shane Ross, like I kind of did appreciate that, you know.
The good old Sunday Independent Day. I'm sure some of you haven't had the misfortune of being called a troubles necrophiliac by the Sunday Independent.
Who was that in the...
But that's for another day.
Was that RDE?
No, yeah.
The Sunday Independent isn't a political organisation, though. It's completely apolitical,
Oh, yeah.
and they just stick to the facts
course,
and
yeah, of
all
course.
that kind of thing. If I was a political journalist, I would be asking myself, well, why haven't I considered to be some sort of a political operator, you know?
Yeah, well, it's not political to uphold the status quo, but it is political to challenge it, yeah, you know.
And Micheál Martin wouldn't actually repeat what he said outside of the Dáil as well, crucially.
No, yeah.
Well, that is crucial.
We have to give credit though to the establishment media for doing a great job of holding us to account.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, they might not want to hold the subjects of our stories to account, the people with actual power, but yeah, they've certainly tried to hold us to account. It seems we only kind of get the phone call, you know, from RTE or other establishment media organisations when we're in trouble, or they think we're in trouble. That's when they want to talk to us.
Of course.
You know, but when we've a big story, you know, and someone else is in trouble, you know, they don't really want to hear from us.
Well, that's par for the course, as you well know now, Roman. Eoghan, just getting back to yourself, you had recently written a piece for Red Roof on the hate speech bill. Do you want to tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, look, I mean, I just think it's a terrible piece of legislation for so many reasons. It's a proposed hate speech act that it's working its way through the Oireachtas at the moment. It's gone through the Dáil and it's to come before the Seanad. It's what can you say about it? It's, you know, it's incredibly far-reaching. It effectively the parts that I'd be most worried about are the powers that it would give the Gardaí in investigating so-called hate offences, and the power that the guards would have for investigation of people's devices and homes. And part of this bill, you know, aims to combat transphobic hate crime, right? And as part of that, it would empower the Gardaí to investigate these potential crimes. But, you know, the Guards are an organisation that shelved an internal gender policy because, in the words of Antoinette Cunningham, who is she's a representative of one of the Garda unions, like, she said that a lot of the Guards don't know about this kind of thing, like, you know, and that, you know, under this policy, you know, Guards would have been possibly subject to disciplinary measures if they misgendered their colleagues, you know, and the Guards say, oh no, look, we can't do this. Like, so, like, these are the guys that we're supposedly looking to combat these crimes. And I kind of find that the bit that I find that I continue to find most frustrating about it is the fact that the loudest opponents of this bill are generally from the right, and, you know, these are people who I said in the piece I wrote for you that, you know, these are people who have been in paroxysms of over phrases like "from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free." You know, these people think that chant is beyond the pale, and they've been in hysterics over that. But now they're opposing this bill on the grounds of, as they would say, free speech. That's another kind of one that grinds my gears a wee bit. I always kind of find when Irish people talk about free speech, that to me is a bit of an Americanism. Like, I always think of freedom of expression. But anyway, I also just think that the left, or the nominal left, or the broad left, whatever you want to call it, has kind of ceded a lot of ground to the right in opposing this bill. And I think it's kind of wild in a country with our history of censorship, on the censorship of even published discussion about abortion. And then particularly with Section 31, which I kind of do think that a lot of what you've been saying and what Paulie and Roman have been saying about this kind of, whatever you want to call it, a toothlessness or a kind of an impotence of the Irish establishment media. I think it's a legacy of Section 31 where, you know, obviously Section 31 first introduced in, I think it was 1960 in the Broadcasting Act, and then it was later in the 70s where measures were introduced to ban Republicans from the airwaves. Effectively, there were different ministers involved, you know, but one minister who certainly came down hard and certainly used these measures quite prodigiously was Conor Cruise O'Brien, a man who later joined the UK Unionist Party. You know, like, but you could see, like, throughout the course of Section 31, you know, there were little, whatever you want to call it, you know, pockets of resistance to it, where I think there was one reporter who interviewed Sean McStiffan, and he interviewed him and then just read a transcript of what he had said. So technically, Sean McStiffan wasn't broadcast over the airwaves. This drove government mad, like, you know, and then they kind of clamped down on it again. The end result of this was government telling journalists what they can and can't publish. And, like, yeah, there were acts of resistance along the way, but broadly speaking, these guys just said, oh yeah, cool. Like, if Conor Cruise O'Brien says we shouldn't interview these guys, I'm going to go with him. And people get up on their high horse about this term, but I mean, if you can't call Conor Cruise O'Brien a West Brit, who can you call? You know, when he was, it's just like... So to me, it's just kind of crazy that, you know, anyone who considers themselves broadly progressive could support this bill. But then you'll see people then like Claire Byrne, who's an RTE presenter. She was questioning. She was interviewing Liam Herrick from the Irish Council for Civil Liberties, and, you know, like, one of the lines of questioning that she put to him was, "Oh well, Donald Trump Jr. and Elon Musk oppose this. Are you happy to be in their corner?" And it's just like, I don't know, it's just like, is that the extent of your feelings on this? That, like, all right, well, these bad people are opposing it, we better oppose it too? You know, it just kind of, yeah, I mean, like, I think, yeah, what I would like to see would be, you know, more progressive, liberal, left, socialist opposition to the bill, because it's a terrible piece of legislation anyway, but it's particularly bad in a country like Ireland.
So getting to the meat on the bones, start with you, Paulie. What, for the audience's sake, tell us about some of the big catches that you've had.
Well, the big story that we had this year was that Leo Varadkar had misled SIPO when they had asked him about a number of donations that were undeclared. Now, to explain that, so under the law, if you receive a donation from an individual or a company over €600, you have to declare it, and that donation cannot exceed €1,000, right? So SIPO wrote to him in 2019, and they said Edelman bought a table at a fundraiser event that you ran. We found that it wasn't declared, so can you please explain that? Varadkar's explanation was that Edelman had been reimbursed by the individuals who were at the table, so therefore it didn't count as a donation exceeding €1,000, and none of it had to be declared because they were, you know, €100, €200 a piece. SIPO then checked with Edelman, and they said, "Is this what happened here?" Edelman wrote back and said, "No, actually, that's not what happened." And that then brought something that Leo Varadkar had said explaining a donation from them in 2022 into question as well. There were other undeclared donations from 2018 that year. One of them was from a barrister, one of them was from the Attorney General, well, the now Attorney General, Rossa Fanning, and the other one was from Centric Health, right? And SIPO wrote to Leo saying, "Are you satisfied?" Now, he'd given the same explanation for, you know, these other donations, saying they were all reimbursed, so I didn't have to declare them. They'd written to him saying, you know, can you explain, one, why Edelman are contradicting you, and two, you know, are you satisfied that this explanation, you know, accounts for what's happened with these other donations? And he just ignored them. right? Because Leo Varadkar doesn't have to answer questions to anyone, apparently. He doesn't have to. So he just refused to.
And it's Sippo as well.
And it's Sippo as
These
well,
guys
which is
know
completely
as well.
toothless,
Yeah.
right? So he just instead of engaging with them and accounting for what he'd done, he was just like, no, I'm not going to answer that. And then they wrote to him again, and we did a story on it, and we asked him about it, and Leo Varadkar then released a statement to us saying, I can confirm that I am not under investigation by Sippo, which was I think he was trying to get off on a kind of a technical term, because it wasn't like an inquiry and maybe not technically an investigation or something
Very
like
legal
that.
response.
Well, we actually never said he was under investigation. We were careful with the language because of how the legislation is worded, and we said that it was, we used words like probe and everything.
Sippo is investigating, which is the language that the mainstream press use whenever Sippo stick an oar into Sinn Féin's business. It's always, Sippo is investigating. So, but can't say it about Leo Varadkar.
So this as well, that was one of the instances where the media did pick it up and they ran with the headline, Leo Varadkar confirms that he is not under investigation by Sippo. And there was also one journalist who's quite well known, who contacted us kind of asking for what we had to back up, what we said in the story. So, we kind of, made sure that we sent it on to him, and he didn't do anything with it. So I'm convinced that it was a fact-finding mission.
Sounds like it. And yourself, Roman, what would you say would be one of the biggest stories that you've worked on?
I'd say probably my favourite story last year was the Nile Collins story that we did. So Nile Collins is a junior minister. He's the Minister of State for Further Education. And the first story that we did, I think, was at the beginning of last year, related to a planning application that he had made, a historic planning application. And basically on that planning application, he lied and said that he was living with his parents in order to circumvent planning rules, very strict planning rules, relating to one-off dwellings. He wanted to build a one-off dwelling in Limerick, where he's from. And the problem was he already owned a house, so he didn't have a housing need. So in order to get around that, as I said, he basically just lied, and he said he was living with his parents, he didn't own any property, and he got planning permission to build that house. I mean, some people would say, that there's, and it is quite controversial, the one-off housing rules, they still exist. And a lot of people would say that, they're problematic. And I think a lot of people would tell fibs on the applications to kind of get around these things. But, this guy is a lawmaker, and a lot of people who do things like that would have to face consequences for it. So we ran that story, and I guess he kind of managed to weasel his way out of it. And the media kind of ran with whatever he was saying. He came into the Dáil and gave a statement, and I think he thought that was the end of it. We did a little bit more digging, and it turned out that his wife had purchased a parcel of land in Limerick that was owned by the council. And a month before the council voted to sell that piece of land, his wife had written in to the council and said, I want to buy this piece of land. And he voted. He was one of the people that voted. His Fianna Fáil colleagues proposed the motion at a council meeting. He was a councillor at the time. And they voted to sell the piece of land, which his wife then bought. And basically no consequences. He's still a minister. There is a Garda investigation into it. Well, it's not. I believe it's not an investigation stage. They've said that they're doing a scoping exercise to see if any legislation was broken, which it seems it might have been the Local Government Act, which states you have to recuse yourself when you've a potential beneficial interest. And there's also a complaint made to the Standards and Public Office Commission but he's still junior minister for further education. And there were a lot of other stories that we did on Nile Collins. A lot of, I would say dodgy dealings, relating to himself, and he hasn't really had to properly account for any of it, And
yourself, Eoghan, how would you view one of your bigger stories?
Yeah, I think I got a bit of crack out of the Robert Troy stories, which again, similar, he's another ex-Fianna Fáil junior minister that was back when it was just myself and Roman. It was 1 August and the Dáil wasn't in session at the time, and this is another thing to get back to Irish media, when this happens, political correspondents will call it silly season because there's nothing to write about, because government departments, TDs, ministers aren't sending press releases. Things are still happening, but just because you're not getting spoon-fed stories, which is why, typically in August, certainly down south, there was a run of years there where it was always the same thing. There'd be stories about out of control seagulls every August, like clockwork, and you'd have some headbanger senator, going oh, the seagulls are out of control in Dublin, we have to do something about this. This is like every year, So we fired into it. We'd covered Robert Troy before, and he was a guy to go back to what we were saying about what the ditch, our aspirations for it and all the rest. We had first run stories about his property holdings. He's a multi-property landlord making a bomb off student accommodation down in Dublin. We'd already published stories like that where, you get some reaction to those kind of stories. People going oh, well, fair play to him. And you're kind of yeah, fine. Lots of other people had a problem with it, And what I found very interesting about the Robert Troy series of stories was before we went to publish, basically Roman had found that he had sold property to a local authority, and when you do that, you have to declare it, and he hadn't done that. So we found this out, thought it was good, and we just started speaking to people, and funny enough, we found out that it wasn't just one time he'd done it, but he'd done it a second time with a different local authority, So we're all right, okay, this is pretty good, And we published the first story, and the media down tools, they were writing about out of control seagulls, etc., etc. Do the first story, and funnily enough, actually, I was back home, and my mum was listening to Philip Boucher-Hayes, and fair play to him. He had Robert Troy on, and I said, he'll hardly ask about that story, but right enough, fair play to Philip. He asked him, and Robert had some answer for it, and so we were all right, okay, sweet. And a day or two later, we did the second story then, and then it starts kind of blowing up, starts getting a little bit of heat on Twitter, and it's all good crack and all the rest, and all the way throughout this, Robert Troy wouldn't speak to us, we were asking him for comment, and we got into this kind of pattern of us asking him for comment for a story, him ignoring us, publishing a story, and then he'd have to go to the mainstream press then, and then go, oh, well, actually what happened here was this, that, the other, and God, I think it must have been over the course of a week, and this is the one thing that, to take it back to his party leader, Eoghan Martin, who said that we're a political organisation, that we're hell-bent on taking down the government, that we're, implying that we're Russian assets, all that kind of stuff. One thing that Eoghan Martin and his kind can't seem to grapple with is that, over the course of that week, the number of phone calls both Roman and I were receiving from people in his constituency, there was one guy actually, he called us up and he said it was the best thing to ever happen to Westmeath, I mean, you know, like quite regularly we'll do a story about, you know, state body or a public figure, and you know, you'll get a few calls afterwards or a few messages, but like Robert Troy and Nile Collins actually as well, you know. The Nile Collins one as well was funny, was, you know, I mean, the first story, it wasn't the first story, there was another story about a property deal. That was an anonymous email, you know, from someone who had been trying their best to have this story told, you know, by anyone, you know, and people didn't want to know about it, you know, and like, look, I'll try to be as objective as possible about it, like, you know, even just like, we publish those stories, actually, funny enough, I think the doll wasn't sitting either that time, you know, so again, no one had anything to write about. It became the biggest, you know, for at least a week, you know, it was the biggest story in the country, like, you know, so like, if the mainstream press could even just see that like, you know, there's an appetite for this kind of stuff and that, you know, people want to read this kind of stuff, like, but they kind of find it hard to kind of get there, like, you know, they're almost getting there, but not moving.
I wonder why. Now, you've been very vocal online, Ollie, about the growth of the right in Ireland. Do you want to tell me a bit about that?
Yeah, you can certainly see, you know, it's something that's certainly been building and building over the last number of years, you know. While Ireland doesn't have a, you know, there isn't a significant far-right presence in the Dáil, and there isn't a significant, you know, there isn't a powerful far-right party that has gained any kind of electoral success. Now, there are people like Matty McGrath from Tipperary who will go around saying that Ireland's being colonised, you know, having very little to say about the continuing colonisation up north. He's very perturbed about what he considers a colonisation of people seeking refuge in the country, you know. But yeah, while there isn't that kind of electorally successful far-right, you know, for years there has been a relatively well-organised far-right community around the country. Now, you know, a lot of these guys are very sensitive about being called far-right. You know, myself and the boys would talk about, like, you know, there were scenes down in Rosscray, you know, a property that was going to be used to house refugees, you know, and people were bussed in, you know, like middle-aged men and women. We've all seen the footage, these guys, you know, screaming at women and children. You know, supposedly they were very worried about you know, so-called unvetted military-age males, whereas here we have women and children, guys screaming at them all the rest, and you have all these guys going like, oh, well, I suppose this makes me far right now, and it's like, yeah, you might be if you're going to Rosscray in the middle of the week to scream at women and children, you know.
You're still tuned into The Conversation, your weekly alternative probe of political events and current affairs around Ireland. I'm joined by our special guests, Eoghan McNeill, Paulie Doyle and Roman Shortall from The Ditch.
I'm actually just after remembering, you know, that Norm Macdonald clip where, you know, he talks to Stephen Merchant, he goes, England's not doing too well right now. You know, Ireland's not doing well. It's you know, like I would say, it's never really, you know, people like Enda Kenny and Fine Gael would have said that we made a great recovery after the after the 2008 crash. I would say we didn't. The austerity programme, which was an ideological wealth transfer in that, you know, 2011-ish to 2014-ish, that kind of, you know, restructured Irish society in certain ways. We've, you know, the COVID-19 pandemic, you know, hasn't been great for the country. People are, you know, like, you don't need to be a genius to see, like, you know, there's a cost of living crisis, there's a housing crisis, you know, like, nobody's having a great time, you know, and against the backdrop of all this, you know, Ireland down south, you know, like, we're projected to have a budget surplus of 25 billion next year. Now, aside from the fact, it drives me mad, this obsession with, like, running a country like it's a company. It's not, like, you know, like, we don't have to have a surplus, first of all. And second of all, spend the money, you know, like, go and spend it. But Fine Gael, Fianna Fáil, Green Coalition won't spend that money, you know. And this is...
Why is that, though? In your eyes, why do you think they're not spending that money?
I think it's First of all, I think it's ideological. I think Nigel Lawson, who was the father of Nigella Lawson, he was a close advisor to Margaret Thatcher. In his diaries, he would have said, about the mass privatisation programmes in Britain during the 80s. He says himself, that like privatising rail networks and national utilities, it wasn't about, what would bring best value for money or what would work best. He says specifically, it's an ideological thing, so I think that is at play there where, I don't think our ruling class parties have any real commitment to, programs like truly free education, truly free healthcare, actual measures that will, bring down the cost of housing. Let's be real about it as well. Fine Gael, Fianna Fáil, and the Green Party, their primary constituency are property owners, and these guys, it's just they're put in a kind of an awkward position where their primary constituency want to see their house values go up, but then also a lot of these people are going to find that their kids are going to be fucked over. So it's just kind of strange balancing act. I think that's a problem. I also think to go back to Roscrea, which was the site of these protests. It was announced this week that that there's a guy down there, local Fianna Fáil TD, Jackie Cahill. And he was, very pleased to announce that government was, it was this, the refugees that were to be housed in Roscrea. I believe it was a hotel, wasn't it? Or one hotel. Jackie Cahill has announced that there's a disused hotel in Roscrea because, the people who were involved in the protests were saying that, the town needs a hotel, et cetera, and Jackie Cahill has come out now and says this other disused hotel, the state is going to buy it and make a community hotel, And one thing that I one of the, I want to out myself here, but one of the most, personally inspiring kind of revolutions for me was, when Fidel Castro rolled up into Havana and basically said, see all these hotels that are owned by US capital and the mafia, we're taking them now. They're ours. It was just to be blunt about it, it was just unreal. And that's what Castro and the boys did, and that was for the good of the revolution. Whereas you have guys like Jackie Cahill in Roscrea going, oh, well, the far right want a hotel, so we're going to do this now,
And just to give viewers an idea of what Jackie Cahill looks like. He's like, if you've ever seen The Wire, he's like the big bald guy in The Wire. That's the sort of character. So you can just imagine him negotiating the purchase of this community hotel to kind of keep all these headbangers sweet.
But it just goes to show that government, repeatedly make these concessions to the right and the far right, whatever you want to call them, in ways that they don't make concessions to the left. one of the biggest protests of my life was held in Dublin last Saturday. It was a pro-Palestine march, and it hasn't, tens of, if you want to give the Irish Times figure on it, tens of thousands. Other people were claiming, a good deal more than that, but it hasn't resulted in any meaningful shift in government policy. Media is similar in that as well, that where you have these flare-ups of, a relatively well-organised far-right, and what do? They get their far-right whisperer, Mr. John McGurk from Gript, a guy who's what was it, not a month or two ago? This is a guy, he's the editor of Gript, he's, a deeply cynical man. A guy who had for anyone else, it would be a career-ending mistake, where there was a stabbing in North Dublin a number of months ago, and the man who allegedly committed the crime is an immigrant, and John McGurk decided to publish this big exclusive about this man's his history with immigration services, made a big splash with it. Like in a week that he's been invited on to all the mainstream, all the mainstream channels going, tell us about the far right, John. Like, like, you're not a member yourself, but you'd know about them, right? Like this kind of shit, like,
They don't exist.
But he had a complete, for anyone else it would be a career ender. He had the wrong guy, like, and the guy, he didn't name the guy, but the guy was readily identifiable. His name was being shared on Twitter. He had to have guarded protection because of what John McGurk published, But the media still will go like, oh, let's listen to John McGurk about what the far right are thinking in ways that they don't really, Irish media, there's a certain deference to the far right in ways that, no one's asking what the far left or the hard left are thinking, but we do kind of make those concessions to the far right,
Like, as well, the threat that these guys have posed as they've kind of been building up momentum has been kind of understated and not recognised by the kind of politicians and the media at every step. The official policy of Drew Harris, the Garda Commissioner, and the Minister for Justice, Ellen McEntee, was that we need to give these guys a light touch because somehow we'd be playing into their hands by arresting them and prosecuting them. And so in the absence of the state taking any action against them, they've just been able to kind of metastasize into this really, really dangerous force that's going around burning down accommodation for asylum seekers and refugees. All the while, the media has tried to minimise what's happening. People like Mick Clifford, who wrote a piece saying there's basically no far right in Ireland, right? Or then when they do acknowledge that these guys are a problem, they have to equivocate. So they'll say there's a threat from far right, and of course the far left as well.
Of course, yeah.
Paul Murphy will from time to time go on a panel show to talk about the far right, and he speaks extremely well on the issue, but almost without fail, people say, well, didn't you sit around John Burton's car? Even though he went to a trial and was found innocent by a jury of his peers, right? Yeah, I don't know. It's just at every turn the state has and the media have minimised it.
So I usually kind of end the show asking the panellists, what happens for the year ahead, but I'm a bit privy to a new exciting project that's upcoming with yourselves, Roman.
So we're going to do a podcast with Red Wolf, with yourself. I think we're going to do initially 12, 13 episodes. I think we're starting maybe next month in February. So I think we're really looking forward to that. It should be good crack.
I think all the crew we're looking forward to ourselves having us up in Belfast, and hopefully we'll see great success with it, which I think we will do anyhow. Listen, lads, it's great to have you up in Belfast. What we're going to do now is we're going to leave the studio and work on our plans over the next coming month. And I'm looking forward to it. So, Eoghan, Paulie, Roman, thank you for coming to the show.
Thank you very much. It's great.
And that does it for another week. We'd love for you to join the conversation by sharing the link to today's programme to help us grow our audience across all our social media platforms. I'd once again like to thank our special guests, Eoghan McNeill, Paulie Doyle and Roman Shorthall from The Ditch. In the meantime, the conversation will be back next week with more investigations and analysis. I'm Sean Murray. Bye for now.